We are. Hey folks, welcome back. We're at session 2 on our applications day, and I'm just pleased as punch to have Bria Para, Ashton, Verdery, and Ben Cornwell here, all old friends and friends of the program. And so it's just a real, a real treat that these 3 presentations came together so nicely and seem to fit so well. The basic organization of this is understanding family and kin networks and how that integrates into the process of aging and death. So it's a really nice. I think I was really pleased with the way that these 3 pieces came together. And so if each of you would, maybe we'll just do them in the order I have them on my sheet here. So maybe start with Bria, then Ben, and then Ashton. Just maybe give us somewhere like 3 to 5 minutes tops of what you think is the key core takeaway or what you want to remind us of, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Sounds good.
Yeah, sounds great.
Bria, the floor is yours.
All right, so I guess I'll start. So the work that I talked about in my presentation is some work that we've been doing over the last 5 to 7 years, trying to understand the social and biological mechanisms underlying the link between social networks and cognitive aging. And so there's quite a lot of information suggesting that there is some kind of association or correlation between social networks, very broadly defined and operationalized. So, when you're looking at the measures that exist in the ADRD literature, it ranges from, number of relationships to frequency of contact, social support scales, social activity participation, subjective loneliness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all this sort of literature out there suggesting that social networks matter, but none of the research when we started sort of down this path had examined this issue from a network's point of view. And so, as all of you know, because you're interested in networks, ego networks in particular are so great for being able to precisely identify what the potential social mechanisms are. And that was sort of what was missing from the literature. It was, there was some conjecture here and there, but no one had really tested any concrete theories about what social processes were actually driving the link between connectedness and dementia, dementia onset, and also the trajectory of cognitive decline. And so we started collecting network data on a cohort of older adults who are at many of whom are at high biological risk for ADRD. Some of them already had MCI or mild cognitive impairment, which is good because then you can see the conversion to ADRD and sort of the trajectory of decline that we wanted to measure. And we paired up with the Indiana Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, and they collect all sorts of really rich clinical cognitive data, but also lots of biomarker data, so structural and functional MRI. And in addition to being a networks person, I'm also a biosociologist. And so what was really interesting for me was being able to link up social networks and the precise measures that we can get with ego network methodology, linking those up to biological mechanisms. Because there was this really nice match between sort of this theory of cognitive reserve that I talked about in my presentation, and sort of bridging social capital or access to large, diverse, loosely connected social networks. And then on the flip side, sort of also a link between bonding social capital, right? So feeling socially integrated, having support, having a small, tightly knit network, and sort of stress and hormonal pathways. And so we set out to test that using network methodology and also some quantitative neuroimaging biomarkers. And so what we found is a lot of evidence for the effects of bridging operating through a cognitive reserve or cognitive resilience mechanism. And so the idea behind this is just simply that when you're interacting with with people that are not people that you see every day, right? So sort of irregular interaction partners, that this is cognitively taxing, right? That you work your brain in ways that you don't work your brain when you're, hanging out with your spouse or your kids or, people that you know really well and you don't have to try hard around, right? And so this is essentially constitutes a kind of access to novel social stimuli, which builds brain resilience, right? Either more robust neural networks, if we're talking about sort of functional MRI, or more sort of plump and healthy, robust brains, if we're talking about structural measures, right? And so we think that that's really a strong pathway, which is nice because through using network methodology, we're able to trace sort of what's the specific social mechanism, and it's really access to social novelty, and then link that to a downstream biological mechanism, and then to cognitive health outcomes. And on the stress side of things, we don't see much evidence for social bonding, but I also, this is going to be the topic of our renewal, because I think that we're not looking at the right kind of dementia. I think that the stress pathways probably operate more in vascular dementia rather than ADRD, which is sort of separate biological pathogenesis. So again, using network methods to sort of hone in on what kind of biological causation is likely operating, which is sort of like my sweet spot and gets me really super excited about science. So I guess that's probably a good place to leave it.
Awesome, that's perfect. Thank you. Ben, you want to jump onto that?
Yeah. So can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this was I'm on the National Social Life Health and Aging Project investigator team, and we've been studying older adults now. We've been tracking a cohort, a couple of panels now of older adults for a while, since 2005, and we're starting to get into the territory of mortality. And this was something that I've not studied mortality hazard rates or anything like that much in the past, and I know about them, and it's an interesting and important area. But thinking about applying network analysis to mortality, people have done this. People like Nicholas Christakis and Felix Elward and others have looked at that, but I'd never done it. And as I was thinking about it, I thought, if I wanted to understand mortality risk, what I would probably do is apply some of the things I learned in graduate school about networks and social structure. And the thing that came out of some of the discussions that we've been having on the Kinship project were largely psychological. There's some psychologists on the project, and medical doctors. And when we talk about mortality, we usually talk about mortality risk as being a physiological, or and then when you talk about widowhood, you think about the psychological impact of widowhood and bereavement and sorrow and sort of depression that comes along with that. And so there's been there have been many discussions about that on the Kinship project. And I thought, well, if I were to bring a social structural, sort of network structural perspective to the study of the effects of widowhood on somebody, what I would want to do is think about the role of network position, because that's what I do as a network analyst. I think about network position and I try to apply that to things. And if you have if you have a hammer, you use it. And so the thing that came up a lot in our discussions was the widowhood effect. And the widowhood effect is very interesting. It's very poignant and sad. It's the fact that and this happened to both of my pairs of grandparents, when one dies, the other dies pretty soon thereafter, usually within a couple of years. And so the question is, why does that happen? And as I said, as we've discussed this in meetings, it's always been a sort of a psychological discussion or a physiological. The physiological explanation is that your body is flooded with stress hormones. Your organs are overwhelmed by stress hormones, and it's just simply unable to deal with it. Psychological explanation is depression, you stop eating. And I thought, what would be the network explanation for this? And the question is, as I've done a little bit of work on this in the past, how about, something relating to network size that's pretty interesting. Obviously having a large number of social contacts can help you with social support, and friends and people can help you deal with things, and that's important. But more about digging a little deeper, the idea of having the extent to which your connections are connected to each other. And this gets a little bit more to network structure. And so we actually have a little bit of data on this in the NSHAP data set. It's egocentric data, self-reported. But the question, and there are two sort of competing hypotheses that emerge immediately as a network analyst when I thought about this. One is, say your spouse has a lot of overlap with your own network. So your friends are, say my wife's friends are her friends. And my initial hypothesis was that would be worse because it's just somehow emotionally a deeper loss, emotional loss, like you lost a part of yourself. The other explanation is somewhat more interesting. This is what actually came out in our data analysis. This is what we reported in our paper. This is what we found, that the loss of somebody who is not well connected to your network, when your spouse is not well connected to your network, is more important because you lose non-redundant contacts. So you lose people whom you otherwise would not have had ties to. Think about organizing a funeral for a spouse when you don't know any of their friends, and how stressful that would be, just for starters. And then start thinking about how you've lost something that you didn't have without them. And so when we ran the data, I was actually surprised to find that, and then it just started making a lot of sense to me, the findings. That you run back to the old Ron Burt, structural holes, and Liz Bott, stuff about division of labor and families from the 1950s, and then it just starts to make a lot of sense. So this is what this paper is really about, the idea that when you lose somebody who's a non-redundant contact, the widowhood effect is amplified. That is, mortality risk increases exponentially more than for people who lose a spouse who is not a non-redundant contact. So that's the paper. I'll leave it there, and I'll let, in the interest of time, move on.
Great. Thank you. Ashton.
Hi. So my presentation, probably one shouldn't admit this, but in some ways, I think it was inspired by a series of rejected articles that I have had, where I have felt that there is this gap in the literature that is underappreciated, and that is sort of the vital role that family and kinship networks play as parts of our social networks. And I think the social networks literature just tends to de-emphasize that. And there's a bit of a gap between family theory and family network studies, and then kind of social networks as a field in and of itself. And I was interested in exploring that, and a lot of my work is motivated around that intersection. One of the things that I've been working on extensively over the years is trying to understand how both close family member, nuclear kind of family member networks are changing, and how kind of more extended kinship networks are changing at kind of larger social scales, and what those changes might imply for health and well-being of individuals. And I think the kind of premise of my talk, it's always interesting when you're grouped in a session with other people, and then I look at Bria's talk or Ben's talk and I say, oh, well, then, that kind of invalidates a lot of the things that I was saying. But I still think that if you compare across the networks field, and just considering some of the largest findings that are often discussed, I think that it is almost like tucked under the rug that in these networks, family ties are driving a lot of the results, like the Framingham Heart Study results from Christakis et al. Over half the ties in that network are kin-based ties. The McPherson and Marsden stuff on declining social networks and social network size, the vast majority of people report more kin as their close confidants than non-kin. And so I think when you look for it, you start, maybe it's the hammer issue that Ben raised, but you start seeing the centrality of these family ties and their comparative lack of neglect in the social networks literature, in my opinion. And I think part of that neglect, it derives from the inability to model these ties, or an insufficient modeling basis for understanding the kind of networks of family and kin, and how those might change across time and place, and by subgroup and things like that. Because they're not as amenable to kind of choice-based, exponential random graph models or other things that are kind of the very popular tools that are available. And so I think my talk was a discussion trying to raise awareness of ways you could study these better with existing survey data. Clearly, the ego network approach that Bria has relied on, and things like that are vital. And then in addition, I think we need ways to kind of understand their macro changes, and how that macro change across time is unfolding. And I think that when you start looking at this, it leads you into sort of shocking conclusions. To me, I think the most surprising graph that I've ever made from my own research is the one that I showed of extended kinship networks in China, and the average size of extended kin networks peaking. The narrative, you would never expect this. The one-child policy has been in place since, depending on how you define it, 1979, 1972. And the idea that extended kinship networks for the average Chinese person are the largest right now than they've ever been in history, I think is a highly counterintuitive finding. And the reason for it is when you study it, it's because of like the decline in mortality in the 50s and 60s, and we're kind of seeing the ramifications of that right now. But this is very contrary to notions of how we think about society. We think of this, historical societies as being highly kin organized, et cetera. But we're, the research suggests that perhaps that is not the full story, and we need to better investigate some of those kind of historical narratives on these sorts of things. So I'll leave it there, and happy to answer any questions.
Awesome, fantastic, thank you. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and open the floor. I've been kind of kicking us off here just to keep things moving, but as I was thinking across these pieces, the one that sort of unexpectedly jumped out to me was the role of bridging across all three of these ways of thinking. I think that the Widowhood Effect, where that was in some ways the main focus of the finding, but I think that in the other two studies as well, it was at least to me, counterintuitive that the ability to bridge into these other sets is going to be so important. And I think for the broader kinship network structure, it raises questions about the role of in-laws, of other sorts of fictive kins, and the kind of, because we tend to think of, I think part of the reason that family networks get discounted is we sort of focus on the nuclear family, sort of the very, very local sort of set. And that might not be, clearly from the other two studies, that's clearly not the thing that might actually be driving a lot, where the juice is in this thing. So I'm just curious if the three of you might just comment on that. Is my perception right? Where are we overlooking bridging? What's the effect here?
Oh, Ben, you're muted.
Yeah, so thank you. So one thing I would say is I agree with you 100%. And this was pressing. Liz Bott talked about this in Family and Social in 1957 and Family and Social Network, and then Burt picked it up in 92 with Structural Holes. The idea that families, and I think what we need to reconceptualize, family, a nuclear family is not just a family, it's a group of people who are connected to other people. And you really can't understand a family structure without understanding the people to whom they're connected, because, for example, household division of labor depends on the ability to connect up with other people outside and to draw resources from outside institutions. And it'd be interesting to see some writing about nuclear family being, how that is inherently inseparable from outside groups. That's the way that's one thing I've thought of as I've been writing this work.
Yeah, I totally agree as well. I mean, first of all, Ashton, it was interesting that you were like, well, these two other studies suggest bridging is really important, but I mean, we assumed bonding was going to be very important. And for the vast majority of outcomes that I study, substance use disorders, mental illness, bonding always matters more, right? So I think in some senses, cognition is a little bit of an odd duck in that way. The other thing is, I think this idea that extended kin are way more important than we typically think about is a really important one. So like in our research with mental illness, and also to some extent with people with complex chronic conditions, the extended kin really come into the network and are activated to support in times of crisis. So particularly when we're thinking about sort of abnormal events and situations where there's a crisis, it really tends to be the extended kin who are the ones that are there. And then they leave the network. They don't leave, they just become inactive, right? So thinking about those as sources of support when it really matters, as opposed to sort of everyday support, is really critical. And I think that points to a methodological issue in ego networks research, which is that a lot of the name generators that we tend to regularly use are very focused, and they elicit core networks that are small, right? So if you have, if your average network size is 4 or 5, you're not getting any information about extended kin or even semi-peripheral network members. And so, we sort of assume that it's the nuclear kin that matter the most because that's what we have the most information on, if you look at sort of the entire body of literature. So it really is a methodological issue. And it's a hard one to solve because, using multiple name generators and collecting peripheral networks is really hard and expensive, and it takes a lot of time, and it's very burdensome. Our network interview in this study, our average network size is about 12, and our network interview is 45 minutes at minimum, to an hour and a half. So, that has to kind of be your sole focus if you're going to do it well, and that's hard to do. So.
Perfect. Ashton?
I guess the two things that I wanted to say is that I definitely agree with what my co-panelists have said. And one of the big sort of flaws as I see it in this gap between sort of the family literature and the networks literature is it is a two-way street in the problems as I see them. I think the networks literature sort of ignores some of the family dynamics that are critical, but the family literature ignores some of the methodological and conceptual insights from the networks literature in ways that I think are problematic as well. With the exception of family systems theory, which is sort of a niche area in psychological science and family science, the idea of embeddedness of these family network relations is really kind of missed. And this paper that I have recently where we're examining the bereavement consequences of losing a grandparent and the extent to which that influence is mediated by its influence on your mother's depression, not just the teenager's depression, I think is sort of one of those ideas that we need to take seriously, this embeddedness of people's relationships, and that the loss of one family member or the activation of a family member is going to kind of change dynamics in ways that maybe, you know, your cousin gets less time with their parents because their parents are helping, you know, your sick parent or something like that. And so there's these family kind of embeddedness dynamics that I think are a little bit understudied, and there's a lot of potential fruit to bear from that, just like Ben's talk about the ways that our spouse kind of conditions our access to kind of networks and how that influences our lives. And I also think the other methodological aspect that was raised by Bria is this idea that family ties could be, you know, highly salient and relevant at certain times, but the family literature kind of defines things on the dependent variable, as like the convoy model of family relations is, you know, who you're interacting with, who you're getting support from over your time, and that's sort of selecting on having the tie to begin with, rather than trying to think of what the choice set of these ties are and how those might be activated. And I think the structural networks perspective on that is really useful and speaks to this idea of, like, when you're facing crisis, who gets activated, these kind of latent ties that could be activated. And that's sort of a gap that's missing in some of the family literature that I think would be really worth exploring. And a lot of the stuff that I've looked at as well shows similar concepts, that these kind of latent ties can be activated when they're needed, but they're not always activated, and we don't have a good understanding of how that's changing that choice set.
Oh, that's really interesting. I think that there's a branch of the network world that's really like the relational events model, sort of that kind of world where it's structural networks come out of the aggregation of lots of activated small timing interactions, and kinship networks are in many ways sort of a pre-cleared path for those things to become activated. But an uncle isn't really an uncle if they never show up at a birthday party. So I think there's something about that kind of interactionist insight that can be layered over networks. And the history of these kinds of models in structural anthropology goes back 80 years. And I think that we've, like a lot of Doug White's work, we sort of think about it in these small scale village settings, or, somewhat pre-modern, to use an out of fashion term, societies. But it's kind of silly to think that it's not as active here. So what about the intervention side? So if we were to flip this around, have you guys learned much from your observational studies of these kinship networks in ways that we might sort of actively, just to bridge to the last session, actively either recruit people or help activate ties that make people's, is there an easy lever here that we're overlooking from a health standpoint?
So there are two layers. So my take is there are a couple of layers to that. One is the actual recruitment. The word recruitment actually brought up a different issue that we've been dealing with in the Kinship project, which is bringing people back for future rounds. And this gets back into some of what Brea was talking about, and with cognitive decline, recruiting people who are in their 70s and 80s for any kind of, for a survey or for an intervention is really difficult. And I've been working with and that gets harder when you're talking about people who are isolated. And so I've been working with Colin Mercate, who is a recent dean at University of Chicago and is also a co-investigator on the Kinship project. We're working on a project that attempts to use network data, to the data that we have from our respondents, to help understand whom we can recruit for future rounds. And we're using there's sort of a two-pronged approach to that. One is, this ties in very well to the topic of this conference. One is health, and Brea's topic, cognitive decline is a really big thing, getting people to respond and then trusting their responses is tricky, when you start looking at whatever kind of measure of cognitive decline you're using, cognitive health you're using. We're finding that you get lower response rates for people who have lower, levels on those measures. And furthermore, higher error rates, Second, how can you trust their network response, especially when you get into things like complex aspects of network structure, like how often you're not only asking them who you're connected to, but you're asking them, how well are those people connected to each other, and trusting those kinds of responses. Then it becomes a more logistical, practical issue, which is you can't find these people if they're not connected to anybody. And so we're finding in our initial data that the people who report 0, 1, or 2, maybe network members at rounds 1 or 2, you can't find them at round 3 or 4 compared to the people who report larger networks at rounds 1 or 2. So it's network size and it's health. And a lot of the health thing is cognitive, and and then there's the network thing. But this ultimately leads to survey non-response and selection issues. And it's not trivial.
Yeah, I completely agree with Ben, and we're sort of dealing with some of these same issues in a state representative survey that we're doing, trying to follow up older adults. And it's a problem in general for who even enters the study, right? Like people who are less connected are less likely to participate to begin with. In our study, the nice thing is because we're linked to an IADRC, they come in for clinical, they get their clinical services essentially through the study. So they continue to come in, which has allowed us to do some work on exactly what Ben is talking about, which is how accurate are the reports of networks from people who have cognitive decline. And Adam, who's on this call actually, wrote a paper using our data about exactly this issue. He's my current postdoc and he's fabulous. I'll just say that. And he learned so much from being in this cohort for so long. And this is how I met him actually, was through this program. So anyway, he's been wonderful. And the paper that he wrote suggests that, interestingly, contrary to what we expected, so what we do is we have a study partner. So that study partner is usually their spouse, if they have a spouse, but sometimes it's a child or a sibling. And what Adam found is that the more impaired you are, the more correlation there is between study partner reports and the focal person reports of networks. And the reason, and that's exactly what you wouldn't expect given sort of forgetting, right? But the reason for it, it's entirely driven by the fact that people with dementia have very small, very interconnected networks. So, if you're thinking about someone who's, very active, maybe still working, has a large friendship group, volunteers, right? They have a lot of more peripheral ties that they're naming that their study partner doesn't know about, right? Which is exactly what Ben was just talking about with mortality. But in cases of people with dementia, they're naming, 3 or 4 ties. They're all, nuclear family members, and they're all connected to one another. So the reports are actually, overlap super well. Well, what I don't know about is sort of the middle area, right? Like as people start to decline, what's driving what, right? So there must be some forgetting, right? So there's like kind of probably a sweet spot there where the problems that Ben is identifying are more of an issue, and we don't yet know exactly what that sweet spot is. So I don't know what the implications are, except that it's hard. It's all hard.
I had a general kind of thing that I wanted to say about the interventions aspect of this, and I can talk about a specific one that we're working on. The general thing is, the World Health Organization definition of health, which has been in use since 1957, I think, or something like that, is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just the absence of disease. And so I do think that it's useful to keep in mind that in a broad conceptualization of health, like consistent with the World Health Organization's definition, interventions that target people's social networks and make them better, and their integration decrease loneliness and things like that are in fact also health interventions just in and of themselves. But on a more specific level, some of the stuff that we're looking at with family-based interventions for networks, my colleague Jonathan Daw and I have a clinical trial for kidney transplant candidates. And the gist of kidney transplants is, if you don't get one, your chances of death are much higher, and life on dialysis is incredibly difficult. You have to go multiple times a week. Patients report great amounts of pain from going. It's the thing that always stuck with me is in our qualitative interviews, somebody would always refer to the dialysis clinic as the vampire clinic, and it's a difficult kind of life to be on dialysis for a long time, and you're not likely to live as long as you would if you were to get a kidney transplant. But unfortunately, we're in a situation where the types of death that you can use the kidney transplants from are kind of declining. So car accidents and things like that. In the last couple of years, they've ticked up, but in general, we need more and more kidney transplants. More and more people are developing end-stage renal disease, but the kind of deceased donor kidney transplant organ sources is not keeping pace with the population growth. So it's sort of this mouthless kind of problem. So the only real solution at this point is increased donations from people who are alive. And for a variety of reasons, historically and medically, you can't get a kidney from just anyone. The immunosuppression technology is getting better and better, but it's good if you have some genetic matches with the person who's giving you a kidney, which generally indicates that family members are a prime source of this. And the data bears this out. I think like 80% of living kidney transplants are from family members. But there are huge racial disparities in this. And for a variety of reasons, we've been able to rule out kind of common explanations that Black Americans, for instance, have. There's a theory that they have fewer healthy members of their kinship networks, which we're not finding is actually the case, which suggests that part of the problem in these racial disparities, because roughly equal numbers of people get evaluated, is that Black Americans and white Americans are sort of searching their networks differently for kidney transplant potential donors. And our clinical trial is providing kind of tools to think about your network in ways that you can sort of group people into tiers that you would be likely to genetically match with them, and they would be likely to be healthy enough to donate. And so we have an intervention where we elicit an extensive kinship network generator, where we on average are yielding about 26 ties. And then we, through that and some kind of data, machine learning kind of approach, figure out, these are kind of the 3 tiers of people. We give people a list. You gave us your cousin Tony and your nephew and these people, and we think that these are the most likely to be, genetic matches and healthy enough to donate based on the conditions that you've told us about them having and existing data. So that's like one arm of our trial, and then the other arm of our experiment is, we found in our qualitative interviews that a lot of people report that they ask someone to donate a kidney and the person says, okay, I'll do it. And they show up at the clinic and they get rejected, or things like that, that these are like negative events, and people really don't have a good way to kind of ask their family members. They find these conversations very difficult to have. And so through a ton of experimental work with like MTurk workers and Qualtrics work people and all these things, we tested a bunch of ways that and qualitative interviews, we tested a bunch of ways that we think will, like a basic rhetoric or a script that people could use to approach family members to initiate these discussions. And we found that certain approaches yield much higher rates of both network member agreement to get evaluated to donate, as well as patient and network member comfort with the conversation. And so we think that that also is a potential source of ways to do this. So the upshot of that is that I think that with network interventions targeting family related things, two areas that need a lot of work are thinking about who people ask for assistance, and how that might be somewhat inefficient sometimes, as well as giving people network-based tools to approach their network members and to solicit assistance in a way that is ethical and culturally responsive, but also gives people the way to engage with network members.
Ashton, can you say a little bit about how you found the using MTurk and some of those other approaches? How did that, those platforms, how did that work for you?
Yeah, so like in general, I think that those platforms have lots of problems. The research literature is, however, relatively clear that experiments on those platforms, the results of experiments are likely to generalize. Jeremy Fries has a bunch of things like on this. And so, we did both vignette-based experiments as well as kind of more like, I don't know, like embedded experiments or however you'd say it. And we found that they are quite a bit of work, but that they're effective. And I think one thing that's really nice with MTurk is it's really cheap to run these. It's a quarter a respondent to run a 2-minute kind of vignette-based experiment or something. So you can do thousands of these and test minor variations in script that maybe make it that allow you to refine things. So one of the things that we found, for instance, was a huge difference between asking people whether they would donate a kidney or be evaluated to donate a kidney. And that yielded a very substantial difference. But then other classic psychological things like there's this risk versus gain kind of framing kind of literature, where if you say like, I will, this will extend my life. Well, there's also a loss and a benefit kind of framing kind of idea that's similar. If you say this will extend my life versus this will improve my quality of life, there's those things didn't actually matter as much, but those things, and we were also testing things like, emphasizing quality of the relationship. So, like, I know you've always been there for me, but I have to ask one more thing for you or something like that. Tended to yield greater agreement and greater comfort from both sides as well, to kind of emphasize relationship quality. And so what we did that I think was useful was we ran the stuff on MTurk, we tested a bunch of stuff, and we winnowed it down to a smaller set of things. And then we ran it on a Qualtrics panel, which is purportedly nationally representative, or at least more nationally representative than MTurk. And the Qualtrics panel that we looked at was people who had relatives who had kidney disease. So it was really like kind of nationally representative of the target population. And I think that was a useful kind of exercise and yielded additional insights that we wouldn't have gained just from the MTurk stuff. So I think you have to kind of think through both the generalizability aspects as well as the scalability of like how many tests you can run.
Thanks.
I think I love that research. I think that's such a cool sort of case for studying tie activation. And it's interesting to think about like what would the different interventions need to focus on, right? Or need to target. And so Ashton's work is, really about how do you activate existing ties? But then there's also thinking about how do we cultivate new ties to improve health. And I don't know which one is easier or harder, honestly. I think they're both hard, but I think when you're thinking about cultivating new ties, if it's going to be an intervention that's scalable, it kind of potentially needs to be at the policy level or like, large national programs. So, when I'm forced to think about policy implications, which, sociologists are not always that good at, to be honest. I like to think about sort of foci of activity and how transitions into and out of different foci of activity are these like pivotal points in the aging career or the illness career where we could be intervening and we often don't. So like retirement is one really obvious one. So like people retire, especially, the research shows men retire and then their networks shrink. So what can we do about that? Could we put something in place that's sort of a reintegration or something that's like a transitional program to help people, likewise transitioning into retirement communities. There's a lot of opportunity there around that shared foci to, generate interventions for network building. I personally can't wait to move into a retirement community. I am so excited about it. Like your friends live next to you, you get to play pickleball and chill in the
It's like being
pool.
back in the dorm.
Yeah,
Exactly.
That sounds
100%.
awesome.
Yes, it's exactly.
I'd do it now if we're
Yes.
socially acceptable.
100%. I can't wait. But then also thinking about things like potential national service programs, like we have the Peace Corps and we have Teach for America, but could we do something that gets youth involved in intergenerational contacts and programming? There's just things like building building outdoor spaces and places that are more friendly for older adults to interact, especially, in low-income neighborhoods. I mean, there's all sorts of, Adam does research on rural older adults networks in rural areas, and that, really is a problem. So anyway, I think there's a lot that we could do, but you sort of have to think about what level does it need to be at and how can we do something scalable, because a lot of these interventions are just not that scalable, or it's really hard to scale them up.
Gabe.
Hi, yeah, thank you to the three of you for this really fascinating conversation. And I love the back and forth is just keeps building. So I just wanted to roll back to the issue or the question of social support and kinship networks in particular. And I was really interested by this obvious statement, but that I don't think we think enough about, which is you don't really choose to break or create new ties in your kinship network. It's an activation process, not so much a friendship creation process that fits the kind of models you were talking about better. I think, but this mixes with an assumption that happens a lot in the social support literature. And I know that Professor Perry has written about this a bunch, but I wanted to connect it with the kinship stuff, which is sometimes the ties are negative, right? They produce a huge amount of stress, a huge amount of negativity. And that's particularly interesting in the context of a kinship network, because you can't tell, it's very difficult, or it's very socially unaccepted to tell your parents to screw off and to just leave. Some people do it though, and sometimes that's a great decision for them. And so when thinking about social support in the context of kinship networks, how do we deal with what I think is driving that problem, which is the fundamental differences between the individual ego and their kinship network on some very important measures of health, for example. So what is the relationship of the kinship network with the medical world in general? So what if I'm somebody who wants to have a medical intervention, but my kinship network are anti-vaxxers, or they don't believe in the particular intervention? Then it kind of flips the problem of trying to de-emphasize the kinship tie. So I don't know if this has come up in the research. I'd love to hear about it.
Certainly in our kidney-based stuff, we definitely see this. Some of the experiments, we have this open-ended kind of response, why wouldn't you give this person a kidney after they've asked you, or why wouldn't you be evaluated or something? And so some of the things that we tested in that was varying the role and experimentally saying it's oh, it's your mom, oh, it's your dad, oh, it's this person. Once they enumerate their network, then we test which person is in the experimental setting, which one is being asked. And what we found there is, sometimes people are well, because F that guy, my dad's an a-hole. And it is often the guy that these relationship things, there's a lot of gender-based kind of ways that this interacts in our kinship networks that I think is also a little underexplored. Yeah, I do think that is a big challenge for this family-based literature. And it's something that is maybe going to be increased as, idea polarization, opinion polarization, some of the research on this, comes out. I think that this might become a bigger issue. One of the big challenges when studying racial disparities in health stuff is the extent to which the Tuskegee experiment and kind of medical system mistrust in the Black community, the damage that experiment caused in terms of health is untapped. I would guess, I'm no economist, so take my word for a grain of salt, but I would guess that there's $1 trillion of damage of health was done from that experiment, and the lack of medical system mistrust, or the increase in medical system mistrust that it created. And I'm curious whether this is going to be a problem going forward for things. You know, with the kidney donation stuff, we do see in our qualitative interviews, at least, some medical system mistrust ideas come out, that, you know, ideas that if you put your name down as an organ transplant candidate, that they're not going to revive you at the hospital. And so this comes out in so, you know, if it's on your license that you're an organ donor, they won't revive you. And this came out extensively in our interviews in Alabama with Black Americans about their opinions about kidney transplantation. And obviously, if you're looking at your kinship network, these kinds of ideas are going to play in. And, you know, it is a broader package of like structural racism, but the extent to which that those problems are going to start to be seen with political polarization is an open question. I think a scary one, if you think about it.
And I mean, so, and Bray, I'll let you, since, you know, you were asked, I'll just add briefly. One thing I would say is there was a great piece by Meryl Silverstein called "Too Much of a Good Thing," which is about this very issue. That is, you know, sometimes having too many people sort of around you in a very dense network can be bad. And I mean, think of the mutual triangulation of surveillance and so on, and not feeling like you can't, if you're an older adult, not being able to get away from it, right? And just that other issue of not having independent ties, you know. And so the bridging thing comes back again, which is, it's useful for, in my opinion, for older adults, anybody really, to have a combination of both close ties, and you get the sort of Coleman-esque, you know, triadic closure, network dense, a little bit of density, and but also a little bit of independence through your network. That means having ties to people that are not connected to those closed triads. And so I would say that for older adults, and I haven't really seen a paper about this, but when we look at, I think Ed Lauman did a piece a few years ago on elder abuse and found that it was higher among people who had dense networks, and where they were only connected to people who all knew each other. And we used the InChap data from wave one, I think. So it wasn't a panel, and it wasn't a longitudinal analysis, but the conclusion was these are people who can't escape from their close network. And that's because, you know, because something has happened, they have had a health event or something like that. They don't have ties to institutions outside of their home. They can't leave their house or whatever. And so they're just kind of with their kid, they live with their kids, or they're a kid and an in-law. And those are the situations where you get risk of abuse. And so that's very important, I think, and that can lead to some very serious problems. So I think the network structure is in some ways a very important ingredient to that, part of that. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, this is something that I am also really interested in, and you know, in our name generators, we always try to distinguish, explicitly ask for people who, you know, are burdensome versus those that you would reach out to for discussion or whatever. Hi, Gabe, your beard's gotten longer. So one thing that I think is really important and interesting about this issue is how critical gender, I think, is in this. And, you know, I think that, like, for example, in Ben's, I would love to know in Ben's study of mortality, whether you looked at gender differences, because I think my guess would be that it's more common for men to be connected to bridging networks through women than vice versa.
Yeah, and you know, because women are more likely to connect men to outside worlds than men are to connect women to outside worlds.
Yeah. And so there, I think that is, you know, a lot of what's driving the research on health benefits of marriage and gender differences in that, right? Like, I think for women, you know, they're the kin keepers, they're the community keepers for their families often. And, you know, that's work, right? So, you know, when we're thinking about what do networks mean for women, what do they do for women? You know, women are the ones that disproportionately are doing the work of cultivating and maintaining networks on behalf of their families. So, you know, therefore the health benefits are a little more ambiguous, right? They're not always universally positive, sort of in the ways that Gabe was, you know, was referring to.
Fantastic. We're getting close to our end here of this session. Other thoughts or comments people want to, that didn't get made, that people want to say hello to? Otherwise, we might take a quick break. And Adam, you were about to say something?
I was. I don't know if
Please, no, jump in.
Well, I don't know
Yes.
if 3 minutes is an appropriate time to do this.
Give it a shot.
So you know what?
Give it a
Actually,
shot. I don't see that Peter showed up, so go ahead and give it a shot too. So, well.
okay, sure. I'll give it a go. And this is actually directed for Ben and your talk, which was really great. And I liked it. Thought it was really creative use of the network data. So I'll ask the question, and if you decide it's going to be a longer answer than 2 minutes, we can just talk about it offline. But one thing I noticed in that talk is you look at partners embeddedness in Ego's network, which makes sense. You ask egocentric network data, and you can use all 3 ways of NCHAP. But when you talk about the partner bringing in ties to someone that the ego doesn't know, the respondent doesn't know, might it make sense also to look at the response, like the widow embeddedness in the partner's network, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but NCHAP has that in the 2nd and 3rd wave, right? I think you lose the 1st wave.
Yeah, we don't have the
actually,
first. Yep, we don't have the first wave of that.
So it'd be a bit of a downside there, but then you could actually find out if they're connected, their partner who's died was connected to people they weren't.
So we've been very careful in our wording of that to refer to in the 1st and 2nd wave as partner embeddedness as opposed to partner network overlap, which I think is a as you correctly point out, a different concept. And so if you have a one-sided view of the network, you really don't have a good sense. And we do have the information though, that, and it would take probably a little bit of analysis, somebody who can do some textual analysis to link the reports of the names that are given by both people to actually determine how much overlap there is, rather than a one-sided view of how much embeddedness one's partner has subjectively. Although I will say that it's useful, you know, this goes back to also Ed Lauman's perspective on this, which is that one's perspective on it is important, almost regardless of how true it is. So like getting a sense of, you know, I think there's this much overlap, and this is what I sense, and this is what I report, and this is what I remember. It is just as useful in some ways for understanding individual level health outcomes as the objective measure. But that's a good point. Thank you so much. Good to see you, Adam, by the way.
As well.
Okay. All right. Well, a big round of applause for our speakers, and I really appreciate it. Thank you for doing this. It's really great. I see that Tom has joined us, so that's good. Peter Kennedy, I'm not sure if he's able to make it today or not. I got an auto reply from him yesterday saying he has some things going on. So he might have to, so hopefully he'll jump in if he can. But otherwise, If it's okay with folks, we might go and just take a quick 5-minute break. Tom, sorry to do that to you. You just jump on and we're going to leave you, but we'll take a quick 5-minute break. I just let people get a coffee and stretch their legs for a minute, and then we'll start at 12:05.